How did you know that? The words came out sharp and accusing, cutting through the humid Missouri air like a blade. Colonel David Marsh stood on the tarmac of Whiteman Air Force Base, his camouflage uniform dark with sweat. His finger pointed directly at the old man in the faded red jacket who stood calmly before him. Behind them, the massive angular shape of the B-2 Spirit stealth bomber sat silent and wounded, thin wisps of smoke still curling from its port engine nacelle. The aircraft was worth over $2 billion. It was also the only platform capable of delivering the mission package that needed to be airborne in less than 4 hours. And it was completely grounded because of a fault that had stumped every engineer, every technician, every expert on the base for the past 18 hours. Until this old man, this janitor who pushed a mop cart through the hangars 3 nights a week, had walked up to the maintenance chief and told him exactly what was wrong and exactly how to fix it. The old man's name was Frank Dalton, though nobody on the base knew that. To them, he was just the night cleaning crew, invisible and silent, emptying trash cans and wiping down workbenches after the day shift went home. He was perhaps 80 years old, his face a roadmap of deep lines carved by sun and time, his white hair cropped close to his skull, his pale blue eyes clear and steady. He wore the same red-brown work jacket every shift, the fabric worn thin at the elbows. No name tag, no identification, nothing to distinguish him from any other contract worker who kept the base running in the shadows. In a world obsessed with credentials and clearances, Frank had chosen anonymity as his final assignment, a kind of peace he'd never found during his classified years. He'd watched generations of airmen come and go, their faces young and eager, their confidence sometimes bordering on arrogance, their respect reserved only for those who wore rank on their shoulders or wings on their chest. Colonel Marsh took a step closer, his shadow falling across the old man's weathered face. I asked you a question. How did you know the problem was in the auxiliary power unit's fuel pressure regulator? That system is classified. The specs are classified. The failure mode you just described isn't even in the technical manuals because those manuals are compartmentalized above your clearance level. So I'll ask you one more time. How did you know that? Frank stood very still, his calloused hands hanging loose at his sides. The morning sun was bright and hot, turning the concrete apron into a griddle, making the air shimmer in waves above the dark composite skin of the wounded bomber. Beyond the aircraft, the rest of the base continued its frantic preparations. Fuel trucks, weapons loaders, crew buses, all moving with desperate urgency around the other bombers that would have to carry the mission alone if this bird couldn't fly. Frank could feel the weight of eyes on him now. Maintenance crews had stopped their work. Security forces had taken notice. A crowd was gathering at a respectful distance, sensing that something significant was unfolding. The colonel was young, maybe 40, his chest heavy with ribbons and badges that marked him as a pilot, a commander, a man who had earned his authority through skill and dedication. He was also scared. Frank could see that clearly. Scared because the mission clock was ticking and his entire career hung on getting that aircraft airborne. Scared because an old janitor had just exposed a gap in security that could end with investigations and reprimands. Scared because he didn't understand what was happening and men in his position hated not understanding. Frank finally spoke, his voice a low rasp that carried the texture of cigarettes long since quit and years spent breathing exhaust fumes and chemical vapors. I know because I helped design that system, Colonel. 35 years ago, when this aircraft was still classified black and didn't have a name the public knew, I was part of the original integration team at Northrop. I watched that APU get bench tested 100 times before it ever went into an airframe. The colonel's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: disbelief, confusion, calculation. A flicker of something that might have been fear. You're telling me you worked on the B-2 program? As what, a janitor? As an aerospace engineer, Frank replied calmly, senior grade. I held a top-secret SCI clearance for 22 years. I retired in 2004. The security badge I carried had my fingerprints coded into magnetic strip before that technology was even commercially available. I spent more hours inside the prototype airframes than most pilots will ever spend flying them. Colonel Marsh stared at him, trying to reconcile the man before him with the claim being made. His training told him this was impossible, that cleared personnel didn't just disappear into contract janitorial work, that expertise of this magnitude didn't go unnoticed and unrecorded, but the specificity of Frank's diagnosis, the absolute confidence with which he'd identified a failure mode that wasn't in any manual, suggested something his pride didn't want to accept. Behind them, a crew chief named Master Sergeant Rosa Delgado had been listening to the entire exchange. She was the one who had received Frank's information, the one who had relayed it to the engineering team, who had then confirmed, to their absolute shock, that the old man was exactly right. The APU fuel pressure regulator had failed in a mode that wasn't supposed to be possible. A microscopic crack in a component that should have been solid, causing a pressure fluctuation so subtle it didn't trigger alarms, but catastrophic enough to prevent engine start. Finding it would have taken days of teardown. Fixing it would take 90 minutes now that they knew where to look. Sergeant Delgado pulled out her phone and sent an urgent text to the base command section. "We have a situation on the flight line." The old man who identified the APU fault claims to be former Northrop engineer with legacy clearance. Colonel Marsh is confronting him publicly. Recommend immediate verification and senior staff presence. The colonel was still processing, his mind working through implications. If you're who you claim to be, why are you working as a janitor? Why didn't you identify yourself when you gave Sergeant Delgado the information? Why did you let us waste 18 hours before you said anything? Frank's expression didn't change. "I didn't say anything because nobody asked me. I work nights. I'm not on the maintenance roster. I'm not part of your command structure. I'm a contract employee who cleans floors. Last night I was emptying the trash in Hangar 7, and I heard your engineers arguing about the fault codes. I listened for a while. When I heard them start talking about replacing the entire engine, I knew they were going down the wrong path, so I told the sergeant what to look for instead." The colonel's jaw tightened. "You had no authority to access that information. Your clearance, if you ever had one, expired 2 decades ago. You could be arrested for revealing classified technical data." Before Frank could respond, the sound of approaching vehicles cut across the flight line. 3 black SUVs and 2 security forces trucks came racing across the tarmac, their lights flashing, engines roaring. They formed a semicircle around the confrontation, doors flying open with military precision. From the lead vehicle emerged Brigadier General Rachel Kincaid, the base commander, a woman in her 50s whose sharp eyes took in the scene instantly. Behind her came the wing commander, the director of operations, the chief of security forces, and a full detail of armed personnel. The crowd of onlookers had swelled now, dozens of airmen and contractors watching from behind safety barriers, phones out, recording everything. General Kincaid walked directly past Colonel Marsh and came to a halt 3 feet from Frank Dalton. She didn't salute. Instead, she extended her hand. "Mr. Dalton, it's been a long time." Frank took her hand, shaking it once. His grip still firm despite his age. "General, good to see you made flag rank." "I knew you would." The general smiled briefly before her expression turned serious. She pivoted to face the assembled crowd, her voice carrying with the authority of command. "For those who don't know, let me educate you. This man is Franklin James Dalton. He holds a doctorate in aerospace engineering from MIT. From 1978 to 2004, he worked for Northrop Grumman on some of the most classified aircraft programs in United States history. He was part of the original stealth technology development team. He contributed to the design of the B-2 Spirit's auxiliary power systems, environmental controls, and avionics integration. He holds 11 patents related to low observable aircraft technology, patents that are still classified and will remain so for another 20 years. After his retirement, he continued as a consultant for the Air Force Research Laboratory until 2012. The general paused, letting the words settle over the stunned observers. She then turned to Colonel Marsh, whose face had gone pale. "Colonel, Mr. Dalton's security clearance may have expired administratively, but his knowledge and his service to this nation remain beyond question. He identified a critical fault that your entire team missed. He may have just saved this mission. Instead of interrogating him, you should be thanking him." The rebuke landed like a physical blow. Colonel Marsh's throat worked. His earlier aggression now transformed into something closer to horror. "General, I apologize. I didn't know. I thought." The general held up a hand. You thought he was just a janitor. You thought someone his age couldn't possibly have relevant expertise. You thought his appearance and his position meant he was beneath your notice. Those assumptions, Colonel, are exactly why we're implementing new protocols as of today. She turned back to Frank. Mr. Dalton, I apologize on behalf of this command for the disrespect you've been shown. Your service to this program and this nation deserves recognition, not suspicion. Frank shook his head slowly. General, with respect, I don't need recognition. I took this job because I wanted to stay close to the work. I like being in the hangars. I like hearing the engines spool up at night. I like knowing these aircraft are still flying. The money doesn't matter. The title doesn't matter. What matters is the mission. The general studied him for a long moment, something like understanding passing between them. She had been a young captain when she'd first met Frank, back when the B-2 program was still shrouded in secrecy and rumor. He'd been the one to explain to her how the radar-absorbent materials actually worked, drawing diagrams on a whiteboard at 2 a.m. while they troubleshot a coating adhesion problem that threatened to delay the entire flight test program. He'd treated her like an equal then, when most of the senior engineers had dismissed her as too young and too female to understand the physics. She'd never forgotten that respect, and she'd never forgotten the depth of knowledge he carried so casually. Nevertheless, she said quietly, your knowledge is too valuable to waste on mop duty. I'm officially requesting you return to consultant status. We'll process an interim clearance renewal within 72 hours. We need you in the maintenance briefings, the technical reviews, the training sessions. These young engineers and technicians need to learn from people like you. Frank looked past her at the B-2, at the maintenance crews who were already swarming over the APU access panels, pulling the faulty regulator, prepping the replacement. The mission clock was still ticking. They had 2.5 hours now. It would be close, but they'd make it. All right, he said finally. I'll help. But I'm keeping the night shift too. I like the quiet. General Kincaid smiled. Deal. She turned to Colonel Marsh. Colonel, you and your maintenance team will attend a mandatory briefing tomorrow morning at 0700 hours. The topic is institutional knowledge, respect for legacy personnel, and how to identify expertise that doesn't come with a uniform or a rank. Mr. Dalton will be leading that briefing. Do you understand? Yes, ma'am, the colonel managed, his voice hoarse. The general and her staff departed as quickly as they'd arrived, leaving the flight line to return to its organized chaos. The crowd dispersed slowly, airmen talking in hushed tones about what they'd just witnessed. Colonel Marsh remained standing on the tarmac, rooted in place, watching as Frank walked slowly toward the maintenance ladder that led up to the bomber's access panel. Sergeant Delgado appeared at the colonel's elbow. Sir, she said carefully, for what it's worth, he didn't want any of this attention. When he told me about the regulator, he asked me not to say where the information came from. He just wanted the bird fixed. The colonel nodded slowly, feeling the full weight of his mistake settling onto his shoulders. He watched as Frank climbed the ladder with surprising agility for a man his age, watched as the old engineer leaned into the access panel and pointed to something the younger technicians couldn't see, watched as understanding bloomed on their faces. This was what real expertise looked like. Not loud, not demanding attention, just quietly, competently solving problems that others couldn't. Within the week, a new program was established across all Air Force bases, called the Legacy Knowledge Initiative. Retired engineers, technicians, and specialists were brought back as consultants and advisors, their decades of hands-on experience recognized as the strategic asset it truly was. The program became a cornerstone of maintenance training, an acknowledgement that institutional memory and hard-won wisdom couldn't be replaced by manuals or software. Frank Dalton's name became known throughout the Air Force maintenance community, though he still refused any formal ceremony or award. His presence shifted from invisible janitor to respected elder, a living library who could diagnose problems that baffled computers and explain solutions that weren't in any database. Young airmen sought him out in the quiet hours, asking questions, learning lessons that would define their careers. 6 weeks later, on a cool evening at a small diner just outside the base gates, Colonel David Marsh sat in a corner booth, his hands wrapped around a coffee cup, staring at the door. He'd been rehearsing what he would say for days. Frank arrived exactly on time, walking slowly, His red-brown jacket zipped against the autumn chill. He saw the colonel and slid into the booth across from him without hesitation. "Colonel," Frank said simply. The colonel swallowed hard. "Mr. Dalton, I wanted to apologize for how I spoke to you that day, for the assumptions I made, for not seeing what was right in front of me. I was wrong. Completely wrong. And I'm sorry." Frank sipped the coffee the waitress had poured. "You were under pressure. The mission was on the line. Your aircraft was broken and you didn't know why. That kind of stress makes people react." The colonel shook his head. "That's not an excuse. I treated you like you were invisible. Like your age meant you couldn't contribute. That's not the kind of officer I want to be." Frank studied him across the table, seeing past the rank and the uniform to the person underneath. "The past 6 weeks," the colonel continued, "working with you, attending the briefings, listening to the legacy engineers you've brought into the program, it's changed how I see everything. I thought I knew how to lead. I thought I understood maintenance. But I was missing the most important piece. I wasn't listening to the people who'd been doing this work longer than I've been alive." "That's wisdom talking," Frank said quietly. "Most people never figure that out. Takes humility to admit you don't know everything. Takes courage to learn from people who don't have the same credentials you do." Before we wrap this story up, I'd like to thank you for reaching this far. And if you enjoyed this story as much as I think you did, then be sure to show your support by liking and subscribing, so this channel can reach more people like you. Now back to the story. The colonel pulled a small notebook from his pocket, the pages filled with handwritten notes. "I've been keeping this. Everything you've taught us about the APU systems, the environmental controls, the failure modes that aren't in the manuals. I want to make sure it gets passed on. That the maintenance pilots and crew chiefs who come after me have access to this knowledge." Frank nodded approvingly. "That's how we keep these birds flying. That's how we honor the people who built them. You're going to be a good commander, David. You've got the technical skills, and now you're learning the human side. That combination is what makes great leaders." The colonel felt something ease in his chest, a burden of shame he'd been carrying since that day on the flight line finally beginning to lift. "Thank you, sir, for giving me the chance to learn, for not writing me off after how I treated you." Frank reached across the table and gripped the younger man's shoulder. "We all need grace sometimes, son. The trick is being humble enough to accept it when it's offered, and wise enough to extend it to others when you're in a position to do so." The two men sat in the diner as evening settled over the planes, a fighter pilot and an aerospace engineer, separated by 4 decades but connected by the same calling. Outside, somewhere in the darkness, the B-2 Spirit bombers sat ready on their alert pads, their swept wings holding secrets that men like Frank Dalton had spent lifetimes creating, and men like David Marsh had sworn to protect. The mission continued, the knowledge passed forward, and in the quiet spaces where mop carts rolled and floors gleamed under fluorescent lights, legends still walked, unnoticed and essential, waiting for the moment when their wisdom would be needed once more.